In the summer of 2019, a woman walked into the most decorated combat training facility in the United States Navy with nothing in her hands and almost nothing on her record. Her name was Sloan Mercer. She had 7 deployments to places the government still will not put on a map. She had 3 commendations that exist in no public database. And she had a coin in her left pocket, small black worn down to bare metal on one side, that she had carried every single day for 2 years without once putting it down. Nobody in that building knew any of it. That was exactly how she intended to walk in. And that was exactly what was going to make the next 90 minutes the most consequential of Lieutenant Commander Brett Voss's career. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado sits at the edge of a narrow strip of California land between San Diego Bay and the Pacific Ocean. On a map, it looks like a geographic accident, a thin finger of Earth pointing south into the water. In reality, it is one of the most intentional pieces of military real estate in the world. The Navy built its most elite training infrastructure there for reasons that are obvious. The moment you stand on the ground, the ocean is right there, the desert an hour east, the mountains 2 hours north. Everything a special operator needs to be broken down and rebuilt is within reach. The base carries a particular smell in the early morning saltwater jet fuel from North Island, and something harder to name, something that comes from decades of difficult people doing difficult things in a concentrated space. Sloan Mercer noticed that smell the moment she stepped off the shuttle from the airport. She stood on the curb with a single duffel bag and took one slow breath. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the quarterdeck without looking at anything twice. The gymnasium where combatives training was conducted was a high-ceilinged building near the southern end of the base. It had the practical ugliness of all military architecture. Concrete block walls painted the color of old bone, fluorescent fixtures that buzzed faintly in the heat, and wide rubber mats that covered roughly half the floor space. The mats were dark blue, worn pale in the center from years of use. On the east wall hung a row of framed photographs, unit photos, formal portraits, a few black and white images of training evolutions going back decades. The men in those photographs had the same look across every era. Not a look of toughness exactly, more a look of compressed purpose, as if they had learned to take everything unnecessary out of their expressions and keep only what the mission required. At 5:30 in the morning, the gymnasium was empty. Sloan Mercer was not supposed to be there yet. Official check-in was at 0800. The administrative office didn't open until 0730. She had no legitimate reason to be standing in the middle of those blue mats in the dark before anyone else arrived. She had asked the duty petty officer at the quarterdeck, a young man barely 20 years old who was clearly not expecting to be tested at that hour, whether the training facility was accessible. He had looked up the access list, found her name, and waved her through without fully understanding why her name was on a list that required no additional authorization. That was the first small thing that happened that day that nobody thought to question. She did not turn on the main lights. The emergency exit signs at each corner of the building gave off enough reddish glow to work with. She set her duffel bag near the wall, took off her jacket, and began to move. What she did for the next 45 minutes was not a workout in any conventional sense. There was no warm-up, no sets, no counting. She moved through a series of positions and transitions that had no name in any published curriculum. An observer, if there had been one, would have noticed that she never once moved at full speed. Everything was slow, deliberate, and completely silent. She was mapping something, running through a spatial geometry that existed in her body rather than in any room. Her feet made no sound on the mat. Her breathing stayed level throughout. At the end of each sequence, she would stand still for several seconds, her eyes unfocused somewhere else entirely. In her left hand, turning slowly between her fingers, was the coin. It was roughly the size of a silver dollar, but heavier. The surface was matte black, the finish long since worn away on the high edges from years of handling. One face was almost completely smooth. Whatever had been embossed there had been rubbed down to a faint ghost of an image, unreadable. The other face still held the outline of a trident, barely visible, more felt than seen. She rolled it across her knuckles, forward, then back, forward, then back. She did this without looking at it, the way a man might worry a ring he has worn for 30 years. At 6:15, she heard the side door open. She did not turn around. She completed the movement she was in the middle of, brought her feet together, and stood still. Then she picked up her jacket from the floor and walked to the wall where her bag was, the coin disappearing into her left pocket in one fluid motion. Chief Petty Officer Grant Delmar came through the side door, the way he came through every door, like a man conserving energy for something more important. He was 51 years old, thick through the shoulders, with the particular economy of movement that comes not from youth and fitness, but from a body that has learned over decades to do exactly what is asked of it and nothing more. His face was the face of someone who had seen enough to stop being surprised by most things. He wore working coveralls rather than a training uniform, which meant he was here for logistics rather than instruction. He ran supply and equipment accountability for the training facility, a job that required him to be there an hour before anyone else most days. He stopped when he saw her. Not a dramatic stop. He didn't freeze or react. He simply paused for one beat longer than he would have if the room had been empty, registered what he was seeing, and then continued toward the equipment cage on the north wall. He unlocked it, began his inventory, and said nothing. Mercer was lacing her training shoes when she heard him come back across the floor behind her. She didn't look up. Early start, Delmar said. It wasn't a question. Habit, she said. He nodded once and walked past her toward the storage closet. That was the entire conversation. But as he passed, his eyes went for just a fraction of a second to her left hand, to the slight rectangular outline visible through the fabric of her jacket pocket, to the worn coin she hadn't fully concealed. He said nothing. He went to the closet, unlocked it, and began pulling out equipment bags for the morning's class. His movements were the same as before. But something in the room had shifted in a way that had no physical cause. By 0700, the gymnasium was beginning to fill. They came in the way junior sailors always come into a space governed by uncertainty in small clusters, reading the room before committing to any position. Most of them were young mid-20s at various points in their technical training pipelines. Some had the lean, disciplined look of people who had been working hard for a long time. Others still carried a softness around the edges that the Navy hadn't finished removing. They spread out along the walls, found spots on the mat, made the small social calculations of people trying to figure out where they stood in a hierarchy they didn't fully understand yet. Seaman First Class Colt Harwick came in with a group of 3 others but peeled away from them as soon as he entered the building. He was 20 years old with an alert quality to his face that went beyond simple youth, the look of someone who had been paying close attention to the world for longer than his age would suggest. He had grown up in eastern Tennessee, the son of a county sheriff, and he had learned before he could drive that the most important thing you could do in any new situation was figure out who actually knew what was happening before you decided who to listen to. He found a spot near the middle of the room where he could see the full floor, the entrance, and the equipment cage without moving his head more than a few degrees in any direction. He sat down, put his forearms on his knees, and began watching. The first thing he noticed was Sloane Mercer. Not because she stood out, that was the thing. She stood in a space near the east wall, and she did almost nothing that drew the eye. She wasn't talking. She wasn't demonstrating anything. She was simply standing with her weight distributed in a way that seemed completely natural and completely still at the same time. Her uniform was older than most in the room, not worn out but seasoned, faded in the specific places that fabric fades when it has been washed in field conditions many times. She was average height, lean without being conspicuously fit, and her face held the particular quality of patience that isn't waiting for anything because it already knows how to occupy time. Colt watched her for a few seconds, looked away, and then found himself looking back. There was something wrong with his initial read of her, and he couldn't find it yet. Petty Officer Dara Whitfield came in last alone and found a place near the far edge of the mat. She was 23 with the careful posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in a room. She had been in the training pipeline for 6 weeks. In that time, she had been publicly corrected more times than she could count, assigned the worst duty shifts with no explanation, and had a piece of equipment mysteriously go missing before an inspection in a way that cost her a formal counseling entry. None of these things had been done by the same person twice. They didn't need to be. The message was institutional. It said this space was not built for you, and we will make the friction high enough that you will eventually decide to leave. She had not left, but she stood at the edge of that mat like someone who was still deciding whether the ground was solid. At 0814 seconds, Lieutenant Commander Brett Voss walked through the main entrance. He was 36 years old, 6 feet 1 inch tall, and built in the way that suggests a man who has spent considerable time and attention on the construction of himself. His uniform was impeccable in the way that takes deliberate effort. Every crease placed every piece of brass exact. He walked into the room like a man who had choreographed his own entrance, which in some unconscious sense he had. He carried a training binder under his left arm, which no one who actually knew what they were doing in combatives training ever brought to the mat. The binder was a signal. It said, "I am the one with the information. You are here to receive it." He scanned the room with the satisfied look of a man taking attendance at his own event. His eyes moved across the assembled sailors with the efficient appraisal of someone categorizing rather than observing. He noted the young faces, the nervous energy, the way the room had oriented itself toward the center of the floor, where the serious work would happen. His gaze passed over Mercer with no change in expression. She registered as background. That would be the first of several things about Voss that would later seem impossible to believe. What very few people in that room knew, and what Voss never discussed, was that the framed photograph on the east wall, fourth from the left, the one showing a Buds class from 2011 standing in formation at the completion of Hell Week, contained a face Voss had studied more carefully than he would ever admit. The name below the photograph read Class 289. Voss had been in Class 289. He had made it to the final evolution of Hell Week before a medical dropout that the official record listed as a tibial stress fracture, but that Voss knew, and that no one else needed to know, was the point at which he had simply run out of something that had nothing to do with his leg. He did not talk about BUD/S. He had built an entire professional identity in the years since on the foundation of what he knew theoretically about special operations, the doctrine, the history, the tactics, rather than what he had done in practice. He was good at his job in the ways that the one could be measured by paperwork and performance reviews, and the impressions of seniors who themselves had never been in a position to assess the difference between knowing and doing. He had found a niche in the training pipeline where knowledge and authority overlapped enough to paper over the gap. He had been there for 3 years. In those 3 years, he had become very comfortable. Comfort in certain personalities curdles. He set his binder on the table near the wall and turned to face the assembled sailors. When he spoke, his voice had the practiced projection of someone who had spent considerable time learning to sound authoritative. Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lieutenant Commander Voss. I run the Advanced Combatives block here. What we do in this room for the next 4 weeks is not theoretical. It is not academic. What you learn here either works or it doesn't, and the only place it matters whether it works is in a situation where the alternative is not coming home. He paused. He was good at pauses. We're going to start today with fundamentals. Not because fundamentals are simple, they are not, but because most of what fails in real-world application is a fundamental that was never drilled past the point of conscious execution. You need your body to know this without your brain being involved. Colt Harwick was watching him. He was also with one part of his attention watching the woman near the east wall. Her expression had not changed. It held the same patient, unfocused quality it had when he first saw her. But something in her eyes, he couldn't name it yet, had shifted slightly when Voss began speaking. A focusing, the adjustment of a lens when the subject it needs to track has finally entered the frame. Voss walked the floor as he talked, establishing territory. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man who owned the space and wanted everyone to understand that. He stopped in front of different sailors as he made each point using proximity as emphasis. When he stopped in front of Dara Whitfield, he held the pause a half-second longer than he had in front of anyone else. Whitfield kept her eyes forward. Voss moved on. He came to Mercer. He stopped. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that should be simple to categorize, but is giving him friction. You're on temporary assignment from where? Personnel processing, sir. Which command? The orders are administrative, sir. I'm waiting for my next assignment. There was a beat. Voss looked at the worn fabric of her uniform. He looked at the absence of any visible qualification pins on her chest. He made a calculation that felt to him like observation, but was actually something else entirely. Right, he said. He moved on. What Colt Harwick noticed, and what he would not be able to fully articulate for several years, was that during the 3 seconds Voss stood in front of Mercer, Mercer did not look at Voss's face. She looked at his hands, then at his left knee, then back to his face, but only briefly before her gaze went soft and distant again. It was a complete technical assessment performed in the time it takes most people to say hello. Colt didn't know what he was seeing, but it left a mark. The first hour of class was instruction, and Voss was competent at instruction. He knew the material. He moved through grip escapes, posture breaking, and basic takedown defense, with the fluency of someone who had studied these things carefully and taught them many times. The sailors followed along on the mat, working in pairs, making the small errors that beginners always make. Voss circulated correcting technique using his hands to adjust positions. He brought Mercer into a demonstration 4 times in that first hour. The first time was to show a common grip attack from a standing position. He took her wrist with more force than a demonstration required and walked through the mechanics while talking to the rest of the room. She was an object in his lesson, a body with the right proportions to illustrate his point about size differential. She held the grip without resistance and without expression. The second time he wanted to show how a defender's instinct to pull away actually worsens the mechanical disadvantage. He held her forearm and pressed downward, narrating the physics of it to the assembled sailors. She did not pull away. She stood with her arm bent at exactly the angle the joint could bear, without injury, absorbing the pressure with no visible effort. He pressed harder. Her arm did not move. He said something about the defender needing to create dynamic force rather than static resistance, and moved on. The third time he held her wrist and said to the room, "The defender's first instinct is usually wrong. Watch what she does when I apply lateral pressure." He applied it. He applied more of it than was necessary. He was watching the room. He was not watching her. What the room saw was that she did nothing. What Grant Delmar, who was now standing near the equipment cage with a clipboard, saw, because he was watching her, rather than Voss, was that her balance had not shifted by a measurable amount in any direction. She had a distribution of weight through her feet, knees, and hips that placed her structural center below the level where Voss's force could access it efficiently. She was not resisting. She was simply occupying a geometry that made resistance unnecessary. Delmar looked down at his clipboard. The fourth time Voss used Mercer in a demonstration, he held her arm at an angle that no demonstration required and said to the room loudly enough for the front 2 rows to hear, "The challenge with a smaller defender is a simple physics problem. You cannot generate sufficient force to destabilize a larger opponent without perfect technique and a very specific setup. Without that setup, he shifted his weight into her arm. There is no counter." In the silence that followed, Mercer said very quietly, almost under her breath, "There's always a counter." It was not directed at Voss. It sounded like someone completing a sentence in their own head that had leaked into the air. Voss didn't hear it, or if he heard it, he chose not to register it. 3 sailors in the front row heard it. Colt Harwick heard it. Dara Whitfield heard it, and something in her face shifted infinitesimally toward a feeling she hadn't allowed herself since her second week of training. At this point, something was already decided. Not in any formal or conscious way, but in the way that things are decided when the correct conditions have been present long enough. Mercer had been in that room for almost 2 hours. She had been handled, directed, used as a prop, and spoken over. She had cataloged everything, the way Voss transferred his weight before applying force. The way his right knee tracked slightly inward under loaded tell that indicated an old medial ligament issue likely untreated. The way his grip was strong but predictable, the thumb position always the same regardless of the angle, the habit of a man who had practiced the grip but not the adjustment. She had assessed all of it the way she assessed all environments, not as a conscious exercise, but as a reflex, the way a musician processes sound or a carpenter processes space. She was not angry. Anger was a luxury she had stopped keeping in stock around the time she was 28, somewhere on the backside of her 3rd deployment, in a moment she didn't revisit often because the memory was not what she would call useful. What she had instead of anger was a very clear and very quiet understanding of how things worked. She understood that rooms like this one had always existed. She understood that men like Voss had always occupied them. She understood that the cost of this kind of error was never paid by the person who made it. It was paid by everyone downstream, the Dara Whitfields of every base, every unit, every pipeline who absorbed the friction until they either broke or left or found some way to calcify around it and keep going. She also understood in a way she couldn't yet name to herself that she was not going to leave this room today the way she had left every other room like it. There was something different about today. She couldn't say what it was. But the coin was warm in her pocket, and the warmth had weight, and the weight had a name. At 11:23, Voss moved the class into dynamic scenario work. This was where the morning changed. He explained the scenario attacker establishing dominant control from a standing position defender working to create space for a counter. He selected pairs. He selected Mercer as his own demonstration partner without particular ceremony as he had done 3 times before. The room gathered in a loose circle. Colt Harwick found a position at the front without consciously choosing it. Whitfield was 4 people to his left, her arms crossed tight across her chest. Voss began talking about the psychology of the attacker. The use of aggression, not just as force, but as a disorienting signal, a way to compromise the defender's decision-making before the physical engagement was fully established. He was not wrong about this. It was accurate doctrine, well-sourced, competently delivered. As he talked, he moved through the beginning of the demonstration, taking Mercer's arm again, establishing his position. Then he began to escalate. It was slow at first, barely distinguishable from the normal intensity of a demonstration. The grip tighter than before, the posture more aggressive. The narration beginning to carry an edge that had nothing to do with pedagogy and everything to do with something that had been building since he first stopped in front of her and found that she wasn't reacting the way she was supposed to react. The attacker, he said, his voice still level, but carrying a new frequency beneath the level, doesn't wait for you to get comfortable. He doesn't care about your experience. He cares about one thing. He shoved her, not violently, not yet, just enough to test whether she would stumble. She didn't stumble. Her feet were where they had always been, and her center stayed where it had always been, and she absorbed the force the way water absorbs a stone without moving around it, just making room for it and then returning. Voss's jaw tightened. He doesn't stop. Voss continued louder now, the edge fully audible. He escalates. He keeps pressure on the problem until the problem breaks. He grabbed her jacket with his free hand. Grant Delmar had put down his clipboard. Colt Harwick had stopped breathing. Dara Whitfield had uncrossed her arms. In a real engagement, Voss said, and his voice was no longer instruction. It was something he was using as cover for something else. There are no pauses. There are no moments to regroup. There is only this. What happened next took less than a second and more than that to explain. His open hand came across in a short arc. It was not a full strike. It was calibrated enough force to demonstrate a point enough to land enough to make a sound. It was not the kind of contact that happens in training. It was the kind of contact that happens when a man mistakes his authority for a right. The sound it made when it connected with the side of Sloan Mercer's jaw was flat and sharp and wrong in a way that was immediately obvious to every person in that room. The room went completely silent. Not the silence before something happens, the silence after. Voss stood with his hands still raised, his expression settling towards something between triumph and confusion. The look of a man who has done a thing he told himself he was going to do and is now waiting for the world to confirm that he was right to do it. Mercer's head had moved perhaps 2 inches from the point of contact. No more. She stood with her feet exactly where they had been, and her hands exactly where they had been, and her face completely, absolutely still. For 1 full second, nothing happened. Then she looked at him. Not at his face, at the mechanical structure of him, the load-bearing angles, the weight distribution, the geometry she had been cataloging since the moment he walked into the room. And then she was already moving. Everything that followed took less time than it takes to read the sentence. Faster than conscious thought. Faster than Voss's nervous system could route the signal from his hand to his brain and back down to his body with any useful instruction. Her left hand came up under his grip and broke it not by pulling, but by rotating her wrist through the precise angle at which his thumb lost its mechanical advantage, transforming his hold into nothing in under 1/10 of a second. Her right hand, which had been at her side, came up to the side of his neck. Not a strike with a fist, but a targeting of the brachial plexus origin with the edge of her stiffened fingers, a neurological command rather than a force application. His right arm dropped. By the time his brain registered the arm, she was already at his hip. She didn't throw him so much as remove the architectural support from beneath him and guide what came next. He was a large man, and mass under gravity follows rules, and she understood those rules in her body the way a musician understands rhythm. She stepped into the space he occupied, used her hip as the pivot point, and redirected the downward vector of his momentum through an arc that was precise and controlled and completely without wasted energy. He went down, not like a man being thrown, but like a structure that has lost its load-bearing walls suddenly and completely, with a thud that was the sound of weight meeting mat rather than violence meeting a body. She was beside him before he finished landing. One knee on his chest, her forearm across his throat, not crushing, not cutting, positioned to make breathing possible, but movement impossible. Her other hand had his remaining arm pinned under her weight at an angle from which he could not generate any useful force without dislocating something. The entire sequence, 1.9 seconds. She looked down at him. Her expression had not changed since he struck her. It did not change now. There was no triumph in it, no anger, no relief. There was only the face of a person who has completed a task that needed completing, waiting for what comes next. Colt Harwick would remember years later that the thing that hit him hardest in that moment was not the speed of what she did, and not the helplessness of Voss on the mat, and not even the sound of the strike that had started it all. It was the coin. In the moment she had come up from the floor and into her position, her jacket had shifted, and the coin had dropped from her pocket and landed face up on the blue mat 3 feet from Voss's head. The trident on its face caught the fluorescent light. Grant Delmar, standing 20 feet away with his clipboard down and his hands still, walked 3 steps forward. He stopped. He looked at the coin. He looked at Mercer. He looked at the coin again. His expression, which had been unreadable throughout the morning, changed. What moved across his face was not surprise. It was recognition. Deep and specific and complete, the recognition of a name you thought you'd never hear again, suddenly spoken aloud in a quiet room. He took one more step forward. He stopped. He stood there. Dara Whitfield was looking at Mercer with an expression that had no name in the language of professional neutrality. It was something that belonged to the part of her that had not yet been trained out. Colt Harwick looked at Voss on the mat, then at Mercer above him, then at Delmar standing still with that expression, then at the coin on the mat. He did not know what he was looking at yet, but he would spend the next 10 years learning. From the rear of the building, a door opened. Footsteps, slow measured, carrying the particular weight of someone who has nothing to prove and nowhere to be except exactly where they are. A figure moved through the shadow at the back of the space into the flat fluorescent light of the main floor. Fleet Master Chief Roy Caldwell had been in the United States Navy for 31 years. He had the face of a man who had seen the institution at its best and its worst, and had decided a long time ago that the institution was worth defending against both. He was 60 years old, unremarkable in height, with the compacted physical economy of a body that had been used hard for a very long time and maintained with the attention of someone who understood it was a tool. The ribbons above his left breast pocket told a story that took more than a glance to read. Most people didn't try. Those who did understand what they were reading tended to find something else to look at afterward. He surveyed the scene with no visible hurry. The sailors on the mat, the cleared space in the center, Voss on his back, Mercer kneeling still in position, the coin on the mat. Caldwell's eyes found the coin. He stopped walking. For 3 seconds, 3 full counted seconds, he stood where he was and looked at it. The worn black metal, the ghost of the trident on its face. The particular grade of wear that comes from years of daily handling rather than age alone. Then he looked up at Mercer. She was already looking at him. In 31 years of service, Fleet Master Chief Roy Caldwell had seen 3 of those coins. He knew exactly what they meant. He knew exactly who carried them. And he knew with a certainty that settled into his chest like a stone into still water that the next few minutes were going to require him to do the most important thing a senior leader can do when he walks into a situation that has already sorted itself out without him. He needed to say the right words in the right order and mean every single one of them. He cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Specialist, he said, on your feet. Not petty officer, not sailor. Specialist. The rank classification used in exactly one corner of the naval special warfare world. The room processed this at different speeds. Some of the sailors didn't catch it. Some caught the word, but not the weight. Colt Harwick caught both. Mercer disengaged from Voss with the same economy she had used for everything else that morning. One clean motion, and she was standing, and her hands were at her sides, and she had picked up the coin from the mat, and her face was exactly as it had been before any of this started. She had not been breathing heavily. Not once. Caldwell looked at the coin in her hand. He looked at her face. He looked at the mark beginning to form along the line of her jaw, the first physical evidence that any of this had touched her at all. Then he turned slowly and looked at Brett Voss, who was getting to his feet with the careful movements of a man reassembling his understanding of his own situation. The temperature in the gymnasium, which had been hot with humidity and bodies and effort, dropped by something that had nothing to do with the ventilation system. Caldwell said very quietly, "Not one word, Commander." Voss closed his mouth. Caldwell turned back to Mercer. He looked at the coin. He held out his hand. She placed it in his palm. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed his hand around it and looked at her with an expression that the sailors in that room would spend years trying to describe accurately and never quite manage. "Get me her full jacket," he said to his aide, who had followed him in and was now standing 2 feet behind him with a tablet, the color slightly gone from his face. "Tier 1 clearance, full access." The aide's fingers moved across the screen. The gymnasium waited. Outside over the Pacific, a marine layer was beginning to burn off the way it always did by mid-morning. The gray thinning at the edges, the light coming through stronger and cleaner, the world clarifying itself by degrees as the day got properly underway. Sloan Mercer stood in the center of the floor and did not move and did not speak. The coin was in Caldwell's hand. The story was about to begin. The aide's tablet made a sound, a short, soft chime that in any other context would have meant nothing. In the silence of that gymnasium, it landed like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody moved. Fleet Master Chief Roy Caldwell stood with the coin in his closed fist and his eyes on Sloan Mercer, in his posture carrying the specific stillness of a man who has learned across 31 years of service that the moments that matter most are almost always the ones that require you to do least. The sailors along the mat's edge had stopped being a class and had become something else witnesses, though none of them had been asked or warned. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead the way they always did. The ventilation fans pushed the same humid air through the same ducts. The building was identical to what it had been 90 minutes ago. The world inside it was not. Brett Voss stood 6 feet from where he had hit the mat and reassembled his physical bearing with the careful attention of a man who understands that how you look in the first 30 seconds after a disaster matters almost as much as the disaster itself. His uniform was twisted at the collar. His right arm still carried a trace of the numbness from the nerve strike, though he would not have admitted this to anyone, including himself. His face had settled into an expression of controlled neutrality that he had been working on for several years, and that was almost convincing if you weren't paying close attention. Caldwell was paying close attention. He looked at Voss for exactly as long as the situation required, and then looked away, which was the cruelest thing he could have done, and he knew it. Colt Harwick had not moved from his position since Mercer came to her feet. He stood at the edge of the mat circle with his arms at his sides in the particular alertness of a young man whose internal model of the world has just been revised in a way that will take years to fully process. He was watching Caldwell. He was watching the coin in Caldwell's hand. He was watching Mercer, who stood in the middle of the floor as though she were waiting for a bus patient and unhurried and entirely present in a way that he could not quite name but could not look away from. Dara Whitfield had not moved either, but the change in her was different in quality. Colt was processing. She was feeling something that had no safe place to go, yet something between relief and fury, the specific emotional compound that forms when a person has been carrying weight alone for long enough and then suddenly, without warning, sees someone else pick it up without being asked. She put her hand over her mouth, not to stop herself from speaking, to give the feeling somewhere to go that wasn't the middle of this room. Caldwell opened his hand and looked at the coin once more. Then he looked at his aide. "Where are we?" "Still processing the authorization, Master Chief. Tier 1 takes biometric confirmation on their end. The aide looked at the screen, flagging the unit designation for a secondary hold. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. Caldwell nodded. He walked to the table near the south wall, not Voss's table with the binder on it, but the equipment table, the working man's table, the one that held Grant Delmar's clipboard and the duty log. He set the coin down flat side up and then stood beside it without touching it. Delmar was standing 4 feet away. The two men had known each other for 11 years, not as friends exactly, but as men who end up in the same institutional spaces over a long career and understand each other without requiring the vocabulary of friendship. Caldwell looked at him. Delmar looked back and said nothing, which told Caldwell everything he needed to know about what Delmar had already figured out. Caldwell turned to the assembled sailors. "Find a seat," he said. "Anywhere on the mat. Sit down." They sat. Voss remained standing. Caldwell looked at him once briefly and Voss sat. The room settled into a low humming silence, the kind of silence that has content in it, that is doing something rather than simply waiting. Caldwell walked back to where Mercer stood. He stopped in front of her and looked at the mark along her jaw. It was more visible now than it had been 2 minutes ago, the tissue asserting its record of what had happened, regardless of what anyone might prefer. He looked at it for 2 seconds. Then he looked at her face. "Are you injured?" he said, not the way you ask a question, the way you transmit a direct line that requires only a yes or no to route properly. "No, Master Chief." He accepted this without comment. He had been in the business of reading the truthfulness of medical self-assessments for 3 decades, and he knew when a person was suppressing pain versus when they genuinely weren't feeling it. She was not suppressing anything. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want a straight answer." "Yes, Master Chief." "What made you move when you did?" He was not asking about the technique. He was asking about the timing, the decision. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone searching for an answer, but the silence of someone deciding how honest to be about an answer they already have. "She was shaking," Mercer said. Caldwell followed the angle of her chin to where Dara Whitfield was sitting on the mat with her hand still at her mouth. He stood there for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked back to the table. He picked up the coin. He held it the way you hold a letter found in a drawer that was written to someone else, except that you recognize the handwriting. Outside the gymnasium's high windows, the California morning was full and bright now. The marine layer was gone. The light coming through the upper glass was the flat, hot light of a summer in San Diego that doesn't apologize for itself. A helicopter moved somewhere in the middle distance, its rotors a slow pulse that came and went like a second heartbeat in the room. Mercer was looking at the coin. Caldwell saw her looking at it, He held it out toward her, the question and the gesture wordless. She did not take it back yet. She looked at it in his hand, and her face did something that it had not done since she walked into the building that morning. It was a very slight tightening at the corner of her right eye, a small deepening of the line between her brows, a compression that lasted less than 2 seconds and then was gone, leaving her face smooth and controlled again. But Caldwell saw it, and in that fraction of a second, he was somewhere else. He was in a briefing room at Bagram Air Base the summer of 2017. He had been there for a logistics review, nothing operational, the mundane machinery of keeping a war functioning. There had been a wall chart showing current unit assignments throughout the theater, most of the data redacted to his level of access. He had looked at it without particular attention. He had noted the DevGru unit designation in the Kandahar sector. He had thought nothing of it. 6 days later, he had read the after-action report summary, 1 KIA. The details were classified above his clearance, but the administrative record of the loss was not. He had read the name. He had thought the way you do when you read a name in a report that someone somewhere was receiving the worst phone call of their life. He had moved on. He had not thought about it again until this morning, until the coin. He came back to the gymnasium. His aide said quietly, "Master Chief, we're in." Caldwell took the tablet. He read the file slowly, not for efficiency, for the weight of each line before the next one arrived. He started at the beginning. 2010, Mercer had been 25 years old. The theater was classified, which told everyone in that room everything the classification was designed to prevent them from knowing. They could not see where she had been, but they could do the arithmetic of the years, and the arithmetic was enough. While most of them were in high school or barely out of it, Sloan Mercer was in a place that did not appear on any publicly accessible map, doing things that would not be described in any document they would ever be cleared to read. He moved through the deployment record without comment. 7 entries, the gaps between them short enough to produce in any person who understood operational tempo a specific recognition, the recognition of a body and a mind being asked for more than regulation recommended and delivering it anyway each time for 9 years. He read the qualifications. He did not editorialize. He did not look up. Advanced close quarters, combat instructor. The sailors looked at each other, then at the floor, then at the woman standing in the center of it. Master breacher, covert methods of entry specialist, Tier 1 operator. He set the tablet down on the table. He let those words occupy the room without assistance. The sailors on the mat had gone completely still. Not the tense stillness of earlier, the held-breath stillness of people waiting for something to happen. This was the stillness of people who have just received information that is reorganizing something inside them, not violently but thoroughly. Colt Harwick was doing the arithmetic of the years again. 7 deployments, 25 to 34. He thought about where he had been at 25. He was 20 now, and the math produced in him a feeling he didn't have precise language for yet. Dara Whitfield had taken her hand from her mouth. She was sitting straight. Her jaw was set. Brett Voss was looking at the floor in front of him. He had not moved since he sat down. Caldwell stood with the tablet in his hands and looked at what he had just read and did not speak for 20 seconds, which in a quiet room is a very long time. Then he looked up. He began to read aloud. His voice was even. It did not perform. It simply transmitted with the precision of a man who understood that the words were doing their own work and did not need his help to land. He read the deployment dates again, slower this time, one by one, so that each year could be heard distinctly. Then the qualifications in full. The sailors who had already processed them the first time heard them differently, the second time now, understanding what she had done to Voss in 2 seconds and hearing the qualifications as the explanation rather than the surprise. Then he turned a page and his voice changed register by one small degree, the way a road changes grade without warning. Kandahar, Afghanistan, September 2017. He read the mission classification marker. He read the language of the after-action summary with the careful neutrality of an official document that is trying to be precise without being human. Tactical assessments submitted by Specialist Mercer at 22:47 hours, 3 hours and 13 minutes prior to breach. Assessment flagged anomaly in target structure north wall based on differential between current satellite imagery and structural schematic. Assessment reviewed by commanding officer. Commanding officer determined operational timeline to proceed as scheduled. He stopped there. The language of that sentence, the passive construction of it, determined operational timeline to proceed. As if the timeline had made its own decision. As if nobody had stood in front of a man and told him to put his helmet on and move to the breach anyway. Caldwell continued, Mission execution commenced at 0100 hours. At 0114 hours, improvised explosive device detonated within target structure, north wall consistent with recent emplacement not captured in prior satellite imagery. One casualty. He looked up from the tablet. Specialist Thomas J. Rice, DevGru, killed in action. The name entered the room and did what names do. There is a sound that a name makes when it belongs to someone who is dead, and it is spoken aloud in a room full of people who didn't know it until that moment. It is not a loud sound. It barely takes up any air, but it carries a weight entirely disproportionate to its volume, and it settles on the people who hear it in different ways depending on what they bring to it. Colt Harwick heard the name and thought of the coin and felt something connect in his chest that he could not have articulated but that he would carry. Dara Whitfield heard the name and thought of the woman standing in the center of the floor who had been carrying that name in her left pocket for 2 years and had walked into this room anyway, had absorbed everything this room had done to her, had waited and waited and waited until the moment required her not to wait anymore. Brett Voss heard the name and closed his eyes. This is what no one in that room knew. In Voss's own file, had anyone thought to read it alongside Mercer's, was a name Class 289, BUD/S, Hell Week 2011. The roster from that class included among the men who completed the evolution, the name Rice Thomas. Tommy Rice had been 3 bunk positions down from Brett Voss in the barracks during the first week. They had spoken perhaps 8 times. They had not been friends exactly, but they had been there at the same time, 2 young men in the same cold water, attempting the same impossible thing, and that proximity had its own kind of meaning, regardless of what either of them did with it afterward. Voss had not completed the evolution. Rice had. Voss had built the years after that on the architecture of what he knew, which was considerable, because Brett Voss was not a stupid man. He was a man who had taken a real wound, the specific wound of falling short at the one thing that mattered most to him, and had covered it with authority and expertise and the management of other people's impressions, which had worked well enough for long enough that he had almost stopped being aware of the covering. Almost. It is the almost that gets you always. The almost means it's still there. The almost means that every room you walk into is a room where you might encounter the thing you're covering, the thing you built over the thing that happened and didn't stop happening just because you stopped looking directly at it. Tommy Rice was dead. The woman who had tried to keep him alive was standing 6 feet away. The coin he had carried was in the shirt pocket of the senior officer in the room, and Brett Voss closed his eyes because there was nowhere else to put it. Caldwell set the tablet face down on the table. He walked back to where Mercer stood. He stopped in front of her. He put the coin in her palm and said one word, not a question, not an invitation, just a container she could fill or leave empty. Kandahar. She looked at the coin. The building was prepped, she said. Her voice carried no excess. I filed the assessment 3 hours before the breach. Full document. The CO had it. I know, Caldwell said. It's in the record. He made his call. Yes. She held the coin without rolling it, flat in her palm looking at it. Tommy said I always called it right. A pause long enough for the words to settle. He was wrong. I called it right that time. That's different. Nobody in the room spoke. It's his coin, she said. He won it. I keep it because somebody should. Caldwell looked at her for the length of time the situation warranted. Then he nodded, not as punctuation but as acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who has buried his own losses and knows without requiring it to be stated the specific weight of what someone else has been carrying and for how long. He put his hand once briefly on the coin in her palm. Then he stepped back. He was not the only one who had been listening. Mercer was looking at a point on the wall above the line of framed photographs. Not at the photographs themselves, above them where the concrete was smooth and unmarked and offered nothing to read. She was somewhere else. She had been somewhere else since Caldwell spoke the name, and now she let herself go there fully because the room was doing what it was doing without requiring anything more from her in this moment. She was in a room in Kandahar. The walls were stone, the good thick stone of buildings that had been standing for 100 years before any American military aircraft had ever crossed that sky. It was 2 in the morning. The power had been off for 6 hours, and the only light was the blue-white glow of mission equipment tablets. NVG battery. Indicators, the small operational lights that kept the tools running when everything else went dark. Outside, somewhere in the city, a dog was barking. It had been barking for 20 minutes. It would bark for another 10 before it stopped. Tommy Rice was sitting against the wall across from her with his legs stretched out and his rifle across his lap and his helmet on the floor beside him because they were in a wait state, and Tommy always took his helmet off in a wait state. He said it was the only luxury a man could afford in the field, and he intended to use it. He was 28 years old. He had a daughter named Claire who was 3, and he talked about her the way he talked about everything that mattered to him in short, specific sentences that held no decoration, just the weight of the thing itself. He had a photograph of Claire in a sealed plastic sleeve in his left breast pocket. He checked on it without taking it out 3 or 4 times a day. Just the gesture of the hand going to the pocket. Just the confirmation that it was still there. Mercer had looked at the building schematic for the target structure 47 times since the brief. Something in the pattern of the walls on the north side did not match the satellite imagery from 6 days prior. The differential was small. It was the kind of small that you could explain with bad imagery, with measurement error, with any number of operational variables that were part of the permanent background noise of this kind of work. But it was also the kind of small that you could explain with a preparation, with a purpose, with someone having done something to that wall in the past 6 days that was not in the schematic. She had raised it in the brief. The commanding officer had heard her. He was 29, fast-tracked, correct in many things, and wrong in this one. He had looked at her assessment and at the imagery and at the operational priority of the target and at the window available, and had made a decision that was fully within his authority and completely wrong. "We're on schedule," he had said. "We go on schedule." She had looked at Rice after the brief. He had looked back at her with the expression he always had when he knew she had called something right, and the right call hadn't been taken. "You called it," he said. "You always call it." "Not always," she said. "Tonight you did." He put his helmet back on. She went back to the schematic. 20 minutes later, they were at the north wall. She was the second through the breach when the device went. The sound was the first thing she lost. Then direction. Then for a period of time she could not measure after the fact everything. When she came back to herself, she was outside. She did not know how she had gotten outside. Her ears were producing a single sustained tone that had nothing to do with the world. Her hands were doing something she could not yet identify clearly. The sky above Kandahar was the specific shade of dark that exists at 2:30 in the morning in the southern latitude when the air is clear, a black that goes all the way to the bottom without reflecting anything back. Her hands were holding something. She looked down. She was holding Tommy Rice's coin. She had found it in the debris. The blast had taken everything from his pockets, distributed the contents of his gears across the floor of a room that no longer had a north wall. But the coin, heavy and flat and built to survive things, had landed 3 feet from where she found herself kneeling, and she had picked it up and she had not put it down since. His photograph of Claire had not survived. The coin had. This is the kind of thing that has no moral to it. It is simply what happened. She had sat outside the field hospital for 2 hours with the coin in her hand. The sustained tone in her ears had gradually resolved into the sounds of the world. Again, voices, equipment, vehicles, the dog that had stopped barking. A medic had checked her twice. She had answered his questions correctly each time. She had been classified as ambulatory, returned to light duty within 72 hours. She had put the coin in her left pocket. She had not taken it out except to hold it. Not once in 2 years. The gymnasium came back. Caldwell was standing at the table. Voss had not moved. The sailors on the mat were utterly still. Mercer blinked once slowly, and then her face was what it had been, and she was standing in the center of the floor in Coronado in the summer of 2019. And everything that needed to happen next was going to happen next, and there was nothing to do but stand straight and wait for it. Caldwell looked at his aide. "Get the base commander on the line," he said. "Tell him I need 10 minutes and that it is not optional." The aide was already reaching for his phone. Caldwell looked at Voss with the full weight of everything he had just read and everything he already knew and everything that had happened in this room. His expression was not anger, because anger would have been too simple, and it was not contempt, because contempt would have been too easy. It was something more clinical than either. The expression of a man who is about to do a thing that needs doing and is not going to enjoy it and is going to do it anyway. "Commander," Caldwell said. Voss looked up. "You will go to the administrative office and wait. You will not make phone calls. You will not speak to anyone except the duty officer. You will wait." He looked at Colt Harwick. "Harwick, escort the commander to the admin office." Colt stood immediately. Voss stood. He straightened his collar with a deliberateness that was the only form of dignity available to him in that moment. He walked toward the door without looking at anyone on the mat, without looking at Mercer, without looking at the table where the coin had been, and he pushed through the side door and was gone. The door swung shut. The room exhaled. Colt Harwick looked at Mercer once before he followed. She was standing in the center of the mat with the coin closed in her left hand, her posture unchanged since she had risen from the floor. She was looking toward the high windows on the south wall, where the California light was coming in, flat and direct and unequivocal, the kind of light that doesn't ask permission and doesn't cast shadows in the wrong direction. He followed Voss out the door. Caldwell waited for the sound of footsteps to fade. Then he stood in the room with the remaining sailors and with Dara Whitfield and with Grant Delmar and with Sloan Mercer, and he took a breath and he looked at all of them. Nobody leaves this building, he said, not because you're detained, because what happens in the next 20 minutes is something I want you to witness. Some things need witnesses. He picked up the tablet. He walked back to Mercer. He stood in front of her and looked at the mark on her jaw one last time, the reddening line of evidence, the skin's honest report of what had occurred before any official document would record it. Then he looked at her eyes, at the gray, steady measuring patience of them. He thought about the woman who had filed a tactical assessment at 22:47 hours and been correct and been disregarded and had carried the consequence of that in her left pocket for 2 years and had walked into this room that morning and stood still and waited and moved only when moving was the only correct thing left to do. He closed her fingers around the coin. "Keep it," he said, not as an instruction, as a recognition. She held it. Caldwell turned to face the room. Outside over the base, a training aircraft made a low pass on its approach to the runway at North Island, the sound of it filling the gymnasium for a few seconds and then fading, and in the silence after it, Roy Caldwell looked at the tablet in his hands and began to read, and this time he read everything aloud, and the room listened, and the story that had been gathering since 5:30 that morning finally arrived at the place it had been moving toward all along. Roy Caldwell read the file the way it deserved to be read, completely without rush, giving each line the space to become what it was before moving to the next one. His voice remained even throughout. It did not perform. It simply delivered the facts in the order they appeared, trusting the facts to do what facts do when they are allowed to arrive without interference. He had already read it silently. Now he read it aloud, and the difference was not in the content, but in what the content did when it entered a room full of people, rather than remaining between one man and a screen. The deployment dates, the theaters, the qualifications, each one carrying the specific weight of a curriculum that most of the sailors in that room would spend full careers trying to approach from the outside. He read them slowly enough that each one could be heard distinctly separated from the others, given its own moment to land. When he reached the Kandahar entry again, he read it with the same steadiness as everything before it. The time of the assessment submission, the nature of the anomaly flagged, the commanding officer's decision, the time of breach, the time of detonation. He read the name, Specialist Thomas J. Rice. He read it the second time with the same voice he had used the first time, which was the only correct way to read it. The name was the name. It did not require inflection to carry its weight. The weight was in the fact of the name, not in how it was said. He set the tablet flat on the table. The gymnasium was completely still. Not the brittle stillness of shock or the held stillness of anticipation. This was the stillness of a room that has received something it is going to carry for a long time, not because it chose to, but because that is what happens when the truth of a thing is placed without decoration in front of people who are paying attention. Grant Delmar had one hand on the equipment cage door and kept it there. Not for support, for something solid to hold while the stillness did its work. Dara Whitfield had her eyes on the floor in front of her crossed legs. Her jaw was set. She was doing the arithmetic of her own 6 weeks in this pipeline in the context of what she had just heard, and the arithmetic was producing results she would need time to process fully, but the first result was already visible in the line of her shoulders, which were straighter than they had been at any point since she walked through the gate. Mercer was looking at a point on the south wall above the high windows. Not at the windows, above them. Her left hand was closed around the coin. The coin was still. Caldwell looked at her. He said something he had not planned to say. It came from below the level of planning from the 31 years that had become not a history he carried, but a material he was made of. The commanding officer from Kandahar. He paused. His name isn't accessible to me at the clearance level I'm reading. But the full record exists, the one that goes up the chain. I want you to know it was read. I want you to know it had consequences. He held her gaze. Not fast enough, not large enough, but consequences. I'm telling you because I think you assumed otherwise. She looked at him. I did assume otherwise, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you. This was the closest Roy Caldwell would come in this room on this morning to an apology on behalf of the institution he had served for 3 decades. It was not a full apology. Institutions do not apologize well or completely, and a man representing one can only go so far within the grammar of his role. But it was real, offered in the plainest possible language, without ceremony or self-congratulation. Mercer received it the same way, without ceremony, without performance, with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who has stopped expecting much from institutions and therefore notices when an institution delivers something beyond the minimum. She nodded once. Caldwell turned to the room. He looked at the sailors on the mat with the expression of a teacher who has just used the most difficult possible material in the most difficult possible way and is now required to say something that will make the difficulty worth something without reducing it. He did not lecture. He had been in the business long enough to know that the moment you begin to tell people what to think about what they have just witnessed, you diminish it. The best thing you can do with a truth that has delivered itself is step aside and let it keep working. He said 3 sentences. You saw something this morning that most people spend a career without seeing. I want you to think about why you didn't see it sooner. Take that thought with you. Then he turned back to Mercer. He stood in front of her. He looked at the 7 deployments in the Kandahar assessment and the 2 seconds on the mat and the mark on her jaw and the 2 years of carrying a dead man's coin through every room and every mission and every form of institutional friction a system not built for her had produced, and she had absorbed it all without becoming smaller. Not without cost. Cost is different from diminishment. She had paid costs that most people in that building could not calculate. But she was exactly the same size she had been like when she walked in before dawn, and she would be the same size when she walked out, and that was not nothing. That was in fact the whole thing. He brought his right hand up. The salute was not theatrical. It was not slow and deliberate in the way designed to be observed. It was sharp and correct and complete, the reflex of genuine respect rather than a performance of it. His arm came to the position and held it, and it meant exactly what it always means in the military, no more and no less. I see you. I acknowledge what you are. I honor it. He held it for 3 full seconds. The sailors on the mat did not move. Grant Delmar did not move. The ventilation fans ran. The light came through the high windows. The base continued its morning around them, the ordinary machinery of a military installation processing another day entirely indifferent to the specific gravity of what was happening inside one gymnasium on its southern end. Mercer returned the salute. Correct. Clean. Without flourish. Caldwell dropped his hand. My apologies for the conduct of my officer, he said. It will be addressed formally. The record of this morning will reflect what occurred. He paused. He had almost said something generic about professionalism or institutional value, and all of those things would have been true, and none of them would have been adequate, and he was experienced enough to know the difference. He said instead, Tommy Rice would have understood. He had no way of knowing if that was true. He had never met Tommy Rice. He had read a name in an after-action summary 2 years ago, and not thought of it again until this morning. But the coin was in her hand, and the trident was barely visible on its worn face, and what needed to be said in that moment was not about policy or procedure or the formal record. It was about the weight she had been carrying and the reason she had been carrying it, and the fact that someone in this room could see both. Mercer looked at him. Something moved in her face. It was not grief exactly, and it was not gratitude exactly. It was the specific expression of a person who has been carrying a thing alone for long enough that the moment someone else acknowledges the weight of it, the acknowledgement itself is briefly destabilizing, not because the weight increases, but because you feel for the first time how much you have been compensating for it. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then she was steady again. Yes, Master Chief, she said. He would have. Caldwell nodded. He picked up the tablet. He looked at Delmar. Grant, get these sailors water and then resume the training schedule. Module 7B, Asymmetric Grappling Fundamentals. Delmar looked at him with the expression of a man who understood that the module he had just been asked to run was going to mean something different in this room from this morning forward, and that this was the correct outcome, and that the correct outcome did not require any additional comment. Yes, Master Chief, he said. Caldwell walked toward the door. He stopped without turning around. She'll be finishing out this training block, he said. Full schedule. A pause. I'd pay attention. Then he walked out. The door closed. The gymnasium held its breath for one more moment, and then Dara Whitfield, sitting on the mat with her shoulders straight and something new and durable organized in her chest, looked at Sloan Mercer and said the first words she had spoken since entering the building that morning. Can you show me how you broke the grip? Mercer looked at her, For the first time since she had walked through the door of that building before dawn, Sloan Mercer almost smiled. It was a very small movement at the corner of her mouth that lasted perhaps a second and a half before her face returned to its professional neutrality. But it was real and it was there, and Dara Whitfield saw it and would remember it for the rest of her career. Yes, Mercer said, I can show you that. She put the coin in her left pocket. She walked to the center of the mat. Come here, she said. Give me your wrist. The morning continued. Brett Voss's office was empty by Friday. The official documentation listed the action as a reassignment, a staff position at a Joint Operations Coordination Center in the Washington area, the kind of role that exists in large organizations to absorb people who can no longer be deployed in positions requiring the trust of the people around them. It was a promotion in grade point. It was in every other sense an ending. He would spend the remainder of his career in a building full of paper and meetings, competent at both never again standing in front of a group of sailors telling them what the real world looked like. What Caldwell had actually said in the 11 minutes he and Voss sat in the base commander's office was not dramatic. It was a precise and documented account of what had occurred in the gymnasium, delivered in the language of formal military accountability, without embellishment and without mercy. The full file on Mercer was open on the table. The Kandahar record was accessible to everyone in that room, with the appropriate clearance, which meant everyone. He said one thing at the end that was not from the file. He said Commander Voss struck a Tier 1 operator who had already lost a teammate to the same category of error he embodies. He did it in front of 20 sailors. Whatever you decide to do with that, sir, understand that those 20 sailors will remember it for the rest of their careers, and the way this command responds to it will be part of what they remember. The base commander looked at him for a long time. Handled, the base commander said. It was. The training curriculum at the Coronado Combatives facility was updated 6 weeks later. A new module was added to the standard block. Module 7B, designated officially as Asymmetric Grappling and Leverage Mechanics for Differential Force Engagements. The module covered grip breaks, weight redistribution under pressure, and counter techniques against opponents with significant size and strength advantages. It was built around the principle that physics does not negotiate, and that technique is the only variable a smaller defender can control with certainty. The module was written by Sloan Mercer. It was thorough and precise. It drew on sources from Judo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Krav Maga, and several techniques that had no published origin because they had been developed and refined in operational contexts that do not produce documentation. It was in the assessment of the senior instructor who reviewed it before submission, the most technically complete combatives curriculum edition the facility had produced in 15 years. Nobody called it the Mercer module, not officially. The official designation was 7B, and that was what it was called in orders and training schedules and after-action reviews. On the mat, it was called something else. Not because anyone decided to call it that, because language finds its own level in closed communities, and the people who use these techniques knew where they had come from and knew what they had cost and knew what they had demonstrated. And the name that emerged from all of that knowing was simply the standard. As in, that's the standard. As in, are you meeting the standard? As in, if you don't know the standard, you're not ready. The blue mat in the gymnasium developed a mark at its center sometime in the fall of 2019. A small star drawn in permanent marker on the worn, pale center of the mat, in the spot where the demonstration circle had stood that August morning. Nobody claimed authorship. Nobody needed to. It was there when people arrived, and it remained when people left, and after a while it was simply part of the mat, the way certain things become part of a place when they have earned the right to be there. Sloan Mercer completed the 4-week training block. She taught Module 7B twice, once to the original class and once to a separate group redirected from another facility. She taught both sessions the same way she had always done everything, thoroughly, precisely, without drama or self-reference. She corrected technique with the same patient directness, whether the person in front of her was getting something right or getting something wrong. She did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself more than once. She did not make the training about anything other than the training. Dara Whitfield attended both sessions voluntarily on time, both days, and stayed 30 minutes after each one to work through variations with whoever was willing to stay. By the end of the second session, she had the grip break at a speed that surprised the sailors working with her, which surprised her, and then she stopped being surprised because she understood that the technique worked regardless of who was executing it, which was the entire point. Colt Harwick attended both sessions. He sat in the front each time. He took notes in a small spiral notebook he had bought at the exchange, writing in the compressed, shorthand of someone who intends to keep the notes for a long time. At the end of the second session, he approached Mercer while she was returning equipment to the storage cage and stood until she turned around. She looked at him. "I laughed that morning," he said. "When Commander Voss was talking, I laughed along with him." Mercer waited. "I wanted you to know I know that," he said. "I don't know what to do with it yet, but I know it." She looked at him for a moment with the calm gray eyes that had been assessing everything in this room since before dawn on a summer morning. "That's more than most people figure out," she said. "Is it enough?" he asked. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said, "but it's where it starts." She went back to the equipment cage. Colt Harwick stood there for another moment alone in the middle of the training floor and then walked out into the California afternoon. He re-enlisted 8 months later. He applied to Buddy Yads 2 years after that. He graduated. He reported to a SEAL team on the East Coast in the spring of 2023, and when his team leader asked him during the first month why he had joined the teams, the real reason, not the one you put in the application, Colt thought about it for a moment and said, "I met someone who showed me what the standard actually looked like. I wanted to find out if I could meet it." His team leader looked at him. "Did she take someone down in a gymnasium?" Colt looked at him. "You heard about it." "Eventually," his team leader said. "Everyone hears about it eventually." 3 weeks after the incident, Roy Caldwell sent a memo to NAVSPEC Warcom. 2 paragraphs. The first contained the factual account of August 14th, 2019. The second contained a recommendation. It read, "Specialist Mercer's handling of a situation that exceeded standard training parameters demonstrated operational composure, tactical restraint, and institutional judgment of the highest order. Recommend consideration for senior training and evaluation roles within NSW pipeline subject to specialists' interest and operational availability. She is the kind of operator who changes what an institution believes is possible. Those are rare. They should be used accordingly." He sent the memo and did not mention it to her. It was in the record now, and the record would find her when the record was ready. That was how things were supposed to work when the institution was functioning correctly. Whether the institution functioned correctly was always the question. It was always the ongoing project. Sloan Mercer left the base on a Tuesday morning in September of 2019 with the same single duffel bag she had arrived with. She signed out through the quarterdeck at 0600. The duty petty officer processed her departure with the routine efficiency of a base that processes departures every day. She walked to the shuttle stop. She waited. She did not look back at the gymnasium or the training facilities or any of the physical structures that held the record of the 6 weeks she had spent there. She looked at the water visible between 2 buildings to the west, the Pacific doing what it always does, being large and indifferent and present in a way that is either comforting or terrifying depending on what you are carrying at the moment you look at it. She had the coin in her left pocket. She had Module 7B filed and approved and active in the curriculum. She had written Dara Whitfield's name in the recommendation section of her personal field notes under a heading that said simply, "Watch this one." The shuttle arrived. She got on. It was September 2029 when Colt Harwick stood on the blue mat at Coronado for the first time in 6 years. He was 30 years old. He had a Master Chief's anchor on his collar that he had not yet fully adjusted to the way you don't fully adjust to something earned under pressure for some time after you've earned it. He had been assigned to the training command 3 weeks earlier, the transfer coming through after 2 back-to-back Eastern Mediterranean deployments that had left him, as he told his outgoing team leader, in need of ground that didn't move. The gymnasium looked the same. High ceiling, bone-colored walls. The row of photographs on the east wall had grown by 4 new frames. The equipment cage was in the same position. The south table was in the same position. The blue mat was in the same position. And at its center, faded to a soft gray at the edges, but still clear in the middle where the marker had gone deep into the rubber, was the star. He stood on it. He stood on it for a long moment, the way you stand in a place that holds something not quite ready to move on to the next thing. Then he turned around. Behind him, 24 sailors were filing into the gymnasium for the first day of the combatives block. They were young in the specific way that sailors are young at the beginning of a training pipeline, unfinished alert, carrying the particular combination of confidence and vulnerability that comes from having passed some tests and not yet taken the most important ones. They spread along the walls the way people always spread along the walls of a room they don't know yet, reading it, finding their positions. He watched them settle. Near the south wall, one of them had stopped. She was looking at the mat with the faint star at its center. looking at it the way a person looks at something that is clearly meaningful without yet knowing why. She was 22 average height with the functional leanness of someone who had been training for a long time without making a performance of it. Her uniform was new, the creases still sharp, the fabric still holding its original color. She stood at the edge of the mat with her shoulders slightly inward and her eyes down in the way of someone who has not yet been given a clear signal that the space belonged to her too. Petty Officer First Class Dara Whitfield came in through the side door with a training binder under her arm. She had been at Coronado for 4 years. She had finished her original pipeline, taken a sea duty assignment on the East Coast, and returned. She ran Module 7B, now 3 blocks a year, and she taught it the way she had learned it, with the full weight of its origin informing everything she said without making the origin explicit until the moment it needed to be made explicit. She looked at Colt Harwick standing on the star, and her expression did the thing it did whenever she encountered something that traced back to that August morning in 2019. A brief internal taking of stock, a private acknowledgement, then the professional continuance. "Master Chief," she said. "Petty Officer," he said. They looked at each other with the slight, precise recognition of two people who share a reference that requires no explanation and has not diminished in 10 years. Colt looked back at the sailors settling onto the mat. He looked at the young woman near the south wall who was still looking at the star. He looked at the star itself at the center of it, where the mark had gone deepest, where the rubber had been worked by a decade of feet embodies in the daily effort of people learning things that were real enough to matter. He walked to the center of the mat. He gathered the sailors around him in a circle facing inward, the first arrangement of a group that is about to become something it wasn't before it walked through the door. He let them settle. He let the room find its level. "Before we start," he said, "I want to tell you about something that happened in this room 10 years ago. Not because it's a story I enjoy telling, because it's the reason Module 7B exists, and Module 7B is where we're beginning, and you should know where things come from before you start using them." He looked at the star beneath his boots. There was a woman who walked into this room. Nobody knew who she was. She was quiet, average height, nothing about her that made you look twice. A senior officer decided based on everything he could see from the outside that she was the least capable person in the room. He paused. He found out how wrong he was in about 2 seconds. She didn't do anything dramatic to correct him. She did exactly what the situation required with exactly the force the situation required and nothing more. He looked up. Her name was Mercer. Specialist Sloan Mercer, DevGru 7 combat deployments. She had carried her teammate's coin in her left pocket for 2 years before she walked into this room. Her teammate's name was Tommy Rice. He was killed in action in Kandahar in 2017 because a commanding officer disregarded her assessment of the target. She filed that assessment 3 hours before the breach. She was right. He didn't listen. Rice didn't come home. He let that sit for the full length of time it needed. Mercer wrote the curriculum you're about to learn. The technique she used that morning is the first thing you'll work through in Module 7B. The star you're sitting around is on the spot where it happened. He looked at the young woman near the south wall. She had stopped looking at the mat and was looking at him. "I was in this room that morning," he said. "I was 20 years old, and I want you to know something because I don't leave this part out when I tell this story. When Commander Voss was talking before any of it happened, I laughed. I laughed along with him." He said it flatly, without self-flagellation, without drama. "I'm telling you that because the lesson isn't only about Mercer. It's about what assumptions cost. What they cost the person your assumption is wrong about, and what they cost you." The room was quiet. "The officer who struck her was not a bad man," Colt continued. "I've thought about that for 10 years, and I keep arriving at the same place. He was a man who had been wrong about something important for a long time and had never been required to look at it directly. This room required him to look at it directly. He didn't recover from that professionally, not because the institution punished him beyond what he deserved, but because the kind of authority he had been exercising requires people to believe you know more than you do. Once that's gone, it doesn't come back." He looked around the circle. What Mercer had was different. She didn't need anyone to believe anything about her. She needed only for the situation to require what she knew. When it did what she knew was enough. That's the standard. That's where the name comes from. Not a person, a principle. The standard is, can you do the thing when the thing is required? Not can you sound like it, not can you perform it. Can you actually do it when it matters with nothing to prove it but the result? He stopped. He let the room hold it. Dara Whitfield, standing near the equipment cage with her training binder at her side, was not looking at Colt. She was looking at the young woman near the south wall, the woman whose shoulders had been pulled slightly inward since she walked through the door. The woman who was now sitting straighter, listening, her eyes up and clear and focused on something she had not yet been able to name but was beginning to recognize. Dara knew that look. She had worn it herself a long time ago in this same room. She set her binder down on the south table. She walked across the floor unhurried, without announcement, and stopped beside the young woman. She stood there. She did not say anything. She did not gesture or explain or draw attention to what she was doing. She simply stood beside her posture easy and direct, and settled the posture of someone who has figured out that the space belongs to her and is not moving. The young woman looked up at her. Dara looked back with the expression of someone who has been where you are and come through it and is now simply present, which is sometimes the only thing that needs to be offered. The young woman straightened. Colt saw it from the center of the mat. He did not stop what he was doing. He did not draw attention to it, but he saw it and he filed it in the part of himself that had been taking notes since the morning he was 20 years old and standing in this room without the faintest idea of what he was watching. He thought about Sloan Mercer. He thought about the coin in her left pocket, worn down another 10 years, the trident fainter on its face, but still, they're still legible to anyone who looked closely and understood what they were seeing. He thought about Tommy Rice, whose name he had spoken aloud in this room for the first time today, and about the daughter named Claire, who would be 13 years old now, growing up in a world her father had helped to hold together, without her knowing exactly how. He thought about the things that pass from one person to the next. Not as inheritance. Inheritance is passive, received without effort. As transmission. A thing passed deliberately from a hand that holds it to a hand that is ready to hold it, changing form, but not meaning, as long as there are people willing to carry it forward without needing anyone to see them do it. He looked at the star on the mat, at the center of it where the mark had gone deepest. 10 years of daily work pressed into rubber rather than worn away by it. The star would outlast the people who knew the story. New sailors would stand on it without knowing its origin, would learn Module 7B without being told why the technique was called the standard, would use it and trust it and be changed by it in ways they would not fully track. And that was fine. That was in fact the whole point. You don't need to know the name of the person who figured something out in order for what they figured out to continue working. The first technique, Colt said, is the grip break. It works because of geometry, not strength. You don't need to overpower the grip. You need to find the angle at which the grip has no mechanical advantage. Once you understand that principle, everything else in this module follows from it. He stepped to the center of the star. Pair up, he said. Find your partner. We're going to start slow. The sailors moved. The pairs formed. Feet found the mat. The gymnasium filled with the specific sounds of people beginning to learn something that would, if they stayed with it long enough and were honest enough about their mistakes, eventually become a part of how they moved through the world. Dara Whitfield and the young woman from the south wall were working together. Dara was adjusting the angle of the young woman's wrist with the patient, precise attention she brought to all of her instruction. She said something quietly. The young woman tried the movement. She tried it again. On the third attempt, something released, and the geometry clicked into place, and the grip broke cleanly, and both of them registered it at the same time, and Dara nodded once with a small smile that meant, yes, that's it. Remember that feeling. Outside over the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, the September morning was doing what California mornings do, arriving without apology, filling the available space with light that found every surface and reported it accurately. The Pacific was out there in its usual condition, vast and patient, and entirely indifferent to human arrangements. The same water it had been when a woman stood on a shuttle curb with a single duffel bag and took one slow breath before walking through the gate. Somewhere beyond that water or below it, or in some location that a map would not usefully describe, Sloan Mercer was working. She was not thinking about Coronado. She was not thinking about the gymnasium, or the star, or the salute, or the 2 seconds. She was thinking about whatever the mission in front of her required her to think about. That is what it means to be a professional, not the absence of a past, but the refusal to let the past take up space that the present work needs. The coin was in her left pocket. It had always been in her left pocket. The trident on its worn face had faded another degree since the morning Caldwell had held it in his palm and understood everything he needed to understand in the time it took him to look up. But it held. The image held. Pressed into metal by someone who understood that certain things need to be made to last, made in the knowledge that the hands that would carry them could not be predicted and did not need to be. Only the object needed to be durable enough to make the passage. Colt Harwick looked at the sailors on the mat. He looked at Dara Whitfield and the young woman working through the grip, break for the fourth time, the movement becoming smoother with each repetition, the geometry becoming something the body was beginning to understand rather than the mind simply directing. He thought about the question he used to ask himself after leaving this room the first time, the question he had carried through BUD/S and 2 deployments in the slow, difficult work of becoming the kind of man he had once watched from 20 feet away without understanding what he was looking at. He had never found a complete answer to it. He had found a practice which is different and more useful. The practice was this: show up. Know your job to the depth it requires. Do not announce yourself. Do not perform your preparation. Be ready for the situation that requires what you know, and when that situation arrives, be enough. Not more than enough. Not a legend. Not a story told in a gymnasium. Enough. Present. Prepared. Ready to be used by the moment rather than to use the moment. That was what Mercer had been that morning. That was what the coin represented. That was what the star was for. He stepped to the edge of the mat. The grip break went around the room pair by pair, the technique traveling from hands that had just learned it to hands that would carry it to the next place, and the next after that, the way things travel when they are worth traveling. Again, Colt said. Slower this time. Feel where the angle is. The work continued. The morning continued. The standard held.